So it's my pleasure to share some insights from the qualitative analysis that we did on social media conversations in Poland. This was done by country analysts, and I was the country analyst in Poland. The analysis we did aimed at unraveling seminal narratives in which EU is somehow elaborated in the social media conversations in the digital communication in the context of three key issues that we have chosen: democracy, future in general terms of what is coming next, but also future of the European Union as such, and recovery plan and its reception. I'm quite anxious to share with you the actual insights, the actual results of our study. So I will not take up too much time to talk about how the database was built. It's probably enough to say that it was built combining quantitative and qualitative methods, and that the final stage of analysis, the qualitative analysis, covered 500 posts that we coded and analyzed the respective codings. The thing that is important is that we obtained the data from Facebook, which is still a leading social media platform in Poland in terms of active users. YouTube is slightly ahead of that, but Facebook is the community-centered platform that's so popular in Poland. So there is a very strong rationale in choosing Facebook as this field of research. Let's start with a very quick glance at our key findings. In the narratives which discuss democracy, the EU is framed quite divergently by conservative and progressive actors as either a threat to Polish traditional values, ways of living, and culture, or, on the contrary, as a source of civilizing cultural influence. The narratives about future are predominantly negative. They are negative because they employ threat as basis for communication. One of the issues that was of high interest to us, that is climate change, is a highly polarized issue, as it is used in current political struggles in Poland. Probably Matt will tell something more about these political orientations in Polish society. What's important to us is that these issues are involved in these political struggles, climate change, but also Poland's presence in the European Union as such. Progressive actors play to some extent with the threat of Poland's exit of the EU, of Polexit, to demonstrate that Poland's economic development is at stake. But, as I will try to demonstrate, this is a short-sighted strategy, as it on one hand overuses this negative emotional stimuli, and on the other, as conversations revolving around recovery plan show, it allows the conservative and in fact anti-European actors and narratives to appropriate positive emotions such as feelings of success and hopes for prosperous futures, not bleak future. This all happens in a very important context. This happens in the context of the European Union's relative invisibility for citizens, the lack of clearly articulated awareness of the European Union's crucial contribution to Poland's well-being. So European Union is transparent in the way that it's not visible for Polish citizens. Its contribution is not that visible. And now let's take a more in-depth look at these insights. With the aim of reconstructing these narratives, the narratives on the selected issues, we investigated those aspects that actually make up those narratives. One of them are social representations. We see them as building blocks that can be used by various actors in various types of narratives. Let's have a look in detail at the social representations of European Union as such. There were many of them. I've chosen 6 to show you them. The first, the gray representations are the ambiguous ones, the green are positive ones, and the red is a clearly negative one. So the EU was represented as police person, presented as if it was a guardian or enforcer of an order, as a financial source, that is, as a funding source, administering vast financial means, as provider, that is, as a source of all kinds of benefits and opportunities for member states, as home, that is, as a source of identity and belonging, as community, that is, source of support, group of states bound by culture and friendship. And the negative one is the representation of the European Union as oppressor, that is, as the European Union as a source of unwanted and oppressive, which is quite important, influence. And here we see which of these representations were actually dominant in the conversations we studied in the quantitative sense. What I think is important here is that the two dominating representations, that is the European Union as police person and the European Union as financial source, but also to some extent provider, picture the European Union as an external reality, as something that exists somewhere else than Poland actually does. Representations which convey the idea of belonging, that is, Poland being part and parcel of the EU, the internal perspective, are much less diffused representations of the EU as home and community. So the one thing that we should consider quite seriously is that these dominant representations of European Union are those that show it as external reality for Poland. In the next step, we looked on how European Union is framed in the digital conversations we listened to. The key finding is that by conservative actors, it is framed as a source of hostile external pressure, and progressive actors as a source of positive external pressure. That is the only alternative, the last resort for Poland's citizens against authoritarian state apparatus. And here in this Sankey diagram, we show a little bit in more detail the co-occurrence of frames. This diagram shows, that there is a general consensus in terms of one frame and one object. So basically, there is the consensus that European founding constitutes an opportunity for development. However, other actors or objects connected with the European Union, such as institutions, European culture and European values, and also European legislation, that is regulations and laws, are placed in divergent frames, either as unjustified influence on Polish values, culture, or legal regulations, or as quite the opposite, as a source of positive civilizing influence. The analysis of what is framed and how it is framed reveals the whole array of devising issues connected with the European Union. There is only one unifying issue, as we saw. I'll talk about that in a second. But as far as the divisive issues are concerned, I think that in general, the lines of divisions we see here are quite coherent. So there is the nationalistic, illiberal, I would even say authoritarian perspective, which claims that democracy is when a state, in this case, this is Poland, is ruled by a majority, by someone who represents the majority, without any external pressure. This is what is called in this narrative independence or sovereignty. And it sees European integration in the political sense, but also in cultural sense, and even the technological innovations, such as, for instance, green technology, as a threat and a sort of attack on Polish independence, on Polish sovereignty. And the progressive perspective on these issues is that it's exactly this kind of pressure, the European pressure, is what actually saves us, that is Poland, from falling into sort of cultural, but also material misery. And that's the unifying issue. Let's take a closer look at that. This is Europe seen as a financial support. So there is this general consensus that Poland actually benefits economically from being in the European Union. However, in the line with the reasoning that was presented just a second ago, the right-wing actors, even in this general consensus, they introduce an idea, or they perceive funding as a tool which is used by European Union to promote the European values, the values that they see as unwanted. In the next step of the analysis, we also considered values and emotions as important components of the narratives. Let's take a look at values. Values which stand up, which are clearly noticeable, I would call materialistic. They are sort of survival values. That is basically economic development is something which is advocated by both progressive and conservative actors. Next group of values which stand out are democratic values. However, we should not forget when we look at that, and we should not be prematurely happy with what we see, because when conservative actors argue for democracy, what they actually argue for is this conception of democracy that we have seen in the division, in these different perceptions of divisive issues. So they often have in mind the illiberal version of democracy. Another quite ambiguous value, quite often mentioned in these conversations, is freedom. Again, freedom is ambiguous value in the sense that is understood divergently. That could be either personal freedom, for instance, freedom from oppressive Polish state, or economic freedom, freedom from framed as oppressive European regulations. This can be also state independence as framed, as advocated by nationalistic right-wing actors. So this value is quite ambiguous. And as far as emotions are concerned, anger clearly stands out. I think we can say that anger is the most present, the dominant emotion in the conversation we're listening to. These conversations are dominated by anger, but also by other negative emotions. One of them is threat. Threat was the code for messages, for postings, for conversations which aimed at eliciting fear, which used fear or threat as a sort of as a means of communication. Another important negative emotion that we see here is contempt. Contempt is quite important because it marks the division, the social divisions, and is also a sign of emotionally tense internal atmosphere in society. A positive emotion that you might have noted is satisfaction. However, it's not positive here. It's more like German Schadenfreude, that is the joy of someone else's failure or problems. All these elements that I showed you so far, they make up the narratives we identified. There were some aspects of these narratives, and now I think we have a couple of minutes to take a look at the actual narratives. First, a glance at democracy narratives. One of the democracy issues that we studied was diversity. Conservative and progressive narratives clash over this issue. This issue reveals how divergent they are, because one of them sees it in terms of individual freedom, the other in terms of European Union's cultural domination, an attempt driven by European Union to cancel the traditional way of living in Polish society. Next element of this narrative is the perception of democracy as such. The visions which clash here are on the one side, the perception of Poland, that's the vision advocated by progressive actors, as an authoritarian regime. In this narrative, the European Union is pictured as last resort for Polish citizens who are oppressed by their own state, and they cannot have no trust in courts or the law, the legal system in Poland. On the other, there is a very self-assured narrative of right-wing actors that Polish state is perfectly democratic because the ruling party does what majority wants, and the European Union pressures should be seen as a sign of hostility towards Poland, a sort of ungrounded, in a way, ungrounded hostility. Especially that this narrative claims that Polish right-wing actors are not actually anti-European actors. They are not against the EU. On the contrary, it is the conservative Poland that represents the actual Christian European values. Thus, this narrative concludes a better European Union is possible, an economy and market, and not culture-oriented or centered union. And I would say, that's why we put that in featured content, I would say that this narrative should be seen as really alarming because it conveys anti-European message, which is dressed as pro-European one. So it conveys nationalistic, xenophobic sentiment along with an articulation of an alternative vision of the European Union. European Union, which acts as a funding institution and a common market, but not as source of values. And the picture here shows Polish Prime Minister, because in his communication, in the official communication of Polish government, this narrative is quite clearly articulated. Let's take a look at future narratives now. The issue of European funding reveals the clash that we already know. Progressive actors advocate for both economic and cultural European Union-led modernization of Poland, the conservative for funding but no strings attached. When the future of the European Union is discussed in these narratives, none of the visions is positive. Progressive actors call for attention to what the government does, presenting it as a series of steps that will ultimately lead towards Pole exit. And conservative actors claim that the European Union's attempt to control the condition of democracy in member states will ultimately lead to disintegration of the European Union as such. So what progressive actors say is that probably the European Union will be there, but without Poland. What the conservative actors say is that if European Union continues to treat Poland that way, it will disintegrate completely. And this is, again, a featured content of a very pro-European narrative, of the progressive one, which graphically shows how much Poland has benefited from the European Union. And it is about future that, in the sense, it shows what can happen to Poland if Poland draws back from the European Union. So this is an attempt to emphasize the Union's contribution to Poland's modernization, because we see comparisons of the same places in the same city, Łódź in central Poland, before accession to European Union and after that. So it is featured content because on the one hand, it draws attention to risks connected with discussing Polexit in a very specific way. And on the second, it fights against this invisibility of European Union, which I mentioned at the very beginning. And the last issue is the recovery plan. When recovery plan is discussed, two emotions clash. Progressive actors elicit fear in their pro-European audiences, showing that the recovery plan is in fact a new Marshall Plan. And this induces strong and very effectively loaded connotations in Polish people, because it connotes with being blocked behind the Iron Curtain for decades or even generations to come. So that's a very fear-loaded message that's embedded in here. Conservative actors, on the contrary, present a narrative of success. So the narrative says that Poland manages very well and we can, but don't have to take the European money because the financial benefits and the cultural losses must be very carefully balanced before Poland says yes to the recovery plan. And again, featured content, well, this is partly funny and partly scary message of progressive actors, which points to the fact that belonging to the European Union means further modernization of Poland, but withdrawing for it backwardness. And this is also a sort of joke on this unique Polish-Hungarian relationship in opposition to the European Union as such. And now to conclude, a couple recommendations, few points of recommendations. So it seems that the key problem derives from the fact that European Union is hardly visible for some parts of Polish society. And this is very ably exploited by conservative actors, including, unfortunately, Polish government, who aim to further erase the European Union's contributions in Poland. This graphic is not an evidence because it was not included in our original database, but it's a perfect illustration. It advertises the recovery fund as financial sources distributed to Polish people by the Polish government. So the caption mentions the amount of money, astronomical, very vast amount of money, and it says it's Poland that counts. And I think you see quite well that European Union is actually nowhere to be seen because these colors are also Polish colors. There is only a shadow of European stars at the very background of this graphic, but this is only a shadow. And that's how this communication looks like. What to do about that? I think that the main point is to clearly communicate how much Poland benefits economically from the participation in the European Union. However, this contribution should be rather framed as social material and not only economic in the sense of amount of money that Poland gets, because it's short-sighted in the sense that in future Poland will also have to contribute to European budget. So we have to try to avoid these purely financial or pure figures as means of showing European contribution to Poland. Instead, probably it would be good to talk about social material contributions through concrete examples like this message from Łódź, because abstractions are quite hard to imagine. In terms of social representations that I mentioned, it would be great if we could pass from a representation of European Union as a huge sack with money, so a source of money, to a representation of European Union as provider, as something that does not give only money, but creates opportunities. Another problem that we diagnosed is that the European Union is not widely discussed in social media conversations. It's not a theme, so to say. This was a very difficult problem we have to tackle when we started to construct the database. And when European Union is discussed, the conversations are highly politicized. European Union is dragged into current political struggles in Poland. So the point would be to portray the European Union as common good, as supporting all members of Polish society, no matter what are their political views, and to involve a diversity of actors in this communication, not only politicians. Next problem, partly connected to that, was that European Union is mostly framed as an external reality. So the answer could be that the narratives should strengthen the sense of belonging. So these representations of European Union as community and home for Poland. And finally, there is the problem of the emotional content of these narratives by progressive actors. So these progressive narratives are to a large extent based on fear and use threat as means of communication. This is quite tiring because there is a limited time that we can respond to negative emotional stimuli. So part of communication should provide positive stimuli to avoid this kind of affective withdrawal. So at least part of that should actually show what and how much has already been achieved. Change for better in ordinary people's lives in Poland. And it should be stressed that this actually happened to a large extent thanks to continuing European Union's support and engagement in Poland. Thank you very much. That was my the data that we as Commons dealt with. That is social media data.